You're dug in on a hill you can't name in a jungle you can't navigate, holding a position you're not supposed to defend, waiting for an enemy that's already behind you. Your rifle is filthy, your boots are rotting. Your last resupply drop missed the clearing by 300 yards and landed in Japanese hands. The man next to you has malaria. The man behind you has dysentery. The man you replaced 3 days ago is still lying in the stream bed below because no one could reach him. You've been walking for 6 weeks, you've lost 30 pounds, and you haven't seen a friendly face outside your column since you crossed the Chindits River into enemy territory. And now you can hear them. Movement in the bamboo, voices in a language you don't understand, coordinating something you can't see. You count the rifle rounds left in your pouches, 43, maybe 44 if you scrape the bottom. Your Bren gunner has 2 magazines. Your officer has a revolver and a map that stopped making sense 2 valleys ago. 50 of you, 300 of them. No artillery, no air support, no reinforcements. This is what it actually meant to be a Chindit in Burma, March 1943. And this is the story of a battle that never made it into the official histories, fought by men the British press would later call Wingate's ghosts, in a campaign that military historians still argue over 80 years later. This is the story of a defensive stand that shouldn't have been possible, in a war that wasn't supposed to be fought this way, by soldiers who weren't supposed to survive. This is the story of what happened when 50 exhausted, disease-ridden, ammunition-starved British and Gurkha troops held a jungle hilltop against a vastly superior Japanese force, and why the truth of that fight reveals more about the nature of jungle warfare, the fragility of morale, and the psychological breaking point of elite infantry than any training manual ever written. In early 1943, the Burma campaign was a catastrophe the British Army was still trying to explain. 12 months earlier, Japan had torn through Malaya, captured Singapore, and pushed the British and Indian armies completely out of Burma in the longest retreat in British military history. The Japanese had moved faster, fought harder, adapted better, and humiliated every unit sent against them. They crossed rivers the British thought were impassable. They outflanked positions the British thought were secure. They infiltrated through jungle the British thought was impenetrable. And they did it with fewer men, less equipment, and supply lines that should have snapped under the weight of their own ambition. By the time the remnants of Burma Corps stumbled back across the Indian border in May 1942, the myth of British imperial invincibility in Asia was dead. Japanese soldiers had become phantoms in the minds of Allied troops, supermen who could see in the dark, warriors who didn't fear death, jungle fighters who moved through vegetation like smoke and struck from directions that shouldn't have existed. The psychological wound was deeper than the territorial loss. British and Indian units that had fought well in North Africa crumbled in Burma. Officers who had commanded with confidence froze when faced with encirclement. Soldiers who had held their ground against German armor abandoned their positions at the sound of Japanese movement in the jungle. It wasn't cowardice. It was something more fundamental. The jungle wasn't a battlefield. It was a psychological weapon that the Japanese had mastered and the British had not. And in the smoking wreckage of that defeat, one man saw an opportunity. Ord Wingate was a brigadier with a reputation for brilliance, madness, or both, depending on who you asked. He'd made his name leading irregular forces in Palestine and Ethiopia, developing theories about deep penetration warfare that made conventional commanders deeply uncomfortable. He didn't believe in front lines. He didn't believe in defensive positions. He didn't believe in the slow, methodical, supply-dependent warfare that had dominated British military doctrine since 1918. He believed in columns, small, self-sufficient infantry units that could be supplied by air, trained to move through enemy territory for weeks at a time, severing supply lines, destroying infrastructure, gathering intelligence, and forcing the enemy to divert forces away from the front. He called them long-range penetration groups. The press would call them Chindits, after the stone lions that guarded Burmese temples. Wingate pitched the concept to Wavell, the commander-in-chief India, in the summer of 1942. The British needed a psychological victory. They needed proof that British troops could operate in the Burmese jungle. They needed to prove to themselves, to the Indians, to the Americans, and to the Japanese that the myth of Japanese invincibility could be broken. Wavell approved the mission, not because he thought it would change the strategic situation, but because he thought it might change the psychological one. By February 1943, Wingate had assembled 3,000 men organized into 7 columns. They were drawn from the 77th Indian Infantry Brigade, a mix of British battalions, Gurkha rifles, and Burmese riflemen, with mule trains to carry supplies, radio operators to coordinate airdrops, and orders to cross the Chindwin River, penetrate over 100 miles into Japanese-occupied Burma, cut the Mandalay-Myitkyina Railway, and prove that British forces could survive behind enemy lines. They crossed on February 14th, Valentine's Day. The Chindwin was wide, cold, and faster than expected. The mules panicked in the current. Radio sets were soaked. Some men lost their packs, but they made it across, and within 48 hours, they had vanished into the jungle. For the first 3 weeks, it worked. The columns moved at night, rested during the day, avoided villages, and hit their targets with precision. They blew railway bridges, cut telegraph lines, destroyed supply dumps, and ambushed isolated Japanese patrols. Airdrops came in on schedule. Casualties were light. Morale was high. The Japanese seemed confused, slow to react, unable to pin down the British columns that kept appearing and disappearing like ghosts. Wingate reported success. The press picked up the story. Churchill, always hungry for good news, began talking about the Chindits as proof that the British could fight and win in the jungle. But by early March, the situation was deteriorating. The Japanese had figured out what was happening. They started deploying tracker units, setting ambushes at water sources, and coordinating sweeps across wide areas to trap the columns. Airdrops became less reliable as the Japanese positioned anti-aircraft guns near known drop zones. The Chindits were losing mules, losing supplies, and losing men to disease and exhaustion at an alarming rate. Dysentery was spreading, malaria was spiking. Feet were rotting inside wet boots. Wingate made the decision to withdraw. The operation had achieved its objectives. Staying longer risked losing entire columns to encirclement or collapse. On March 24th, he gave the order. All columns were to turn around, break into smaller dispersal groups if necessary, and make for the Chindwin River using whatever routes seemed safest. Some columns made it back relatively intact, others disintegrated, and one column, moving through a narrow valley west of the railway, stumbled into a situation that would test everything Wingate's training had tried to teach them. Column 5 was led by Major Bernard Ferguson, an officer from the Black Watch with a reputation for calm under pressure and a talent for keeping exhausted men moving when logic said they should collapse. His column had been operating south of Bonchong, hitting targets along the railway, when the withdrawal order came through. He had 76 men left, half British, half Gurkha, 16 mules, 3 working radios, and a Japanese blocking force forming somewhere between his current position and the river. Ferguson decided to move northwest, parallel to the main withdrawal route, but offset enough to avoid the areas where Japanese forces were concentrating. It was a gamble. The terrain was harder, the map was unreliable, but it might give them a chance to slip through undetected. They moved for 4 days without contact. The jungle was dense, suffocating, and loud with insects. The temperature climbed into the 90s. Humidity turned the air into soup. Men were drinking from streams without purification tablets because they'd run out. Diarrhea was constant. Some men were stumbling, barely conscious, held upright by their mates. On March 28th, they reached a ridgeline overlooking a valley that wasn't on the map. Ferguson sent scouts forward. The scouts came back with bad news. There was a Japanese supply column moving through the valley below. Trucks, maybe 100 troops, moving west, which meant they were part of a blocking operation designed to intercept retreating Chindit columns. Ferguson had 2 choices. He could try to detour around the valley, which would add days to their march and increase the chances of running into more Japanese forces. Or he could wait for the Japanese column to pass, then cross the valley at night and continue northwest. He chose to wait. They moved into a concealed position on the ridgeline, settled into the undergrowth, and prepared to sit tight until nightfall. The Japanese column moved slowly through the valley, stopping frequently, setting up temporary positions, sending out patrols. It took hours for them to pass. By the time the last truck disappeared into the jungle on the far side of the valley, it was nearly dark. Ferguson gave the order to move. They descended into the valley, crossed a narrow stream at the bottom, and began climbing the opposite slope. The ground was loose, slippery, covered in rotting vegetation. The mules struggled. Men fell, got back up, fell again. By the time they reached the top of the slope, they were on another ridgeline, narrower than the first, covered in thick bamboo and secondary jungle. And that's when the scouts came back with worse news. There were voices ahead, movement, lots of it. The Japanese weren't just passing through the area. They were setting up a blocking position on the next ridgeline, less than a mile away. Ferguson sent another patrol forward to confirm. The patrol came back within 30 minutes. Confirmed. Japanese forces were digging in across the entire approach to the northwest. At least 2 companies, maybe more. Heavy machine guns, mortars. They were setting up a strong point designed to catch any Chindit column trying to use this route. Ferguson gathered his officers. They spread the map on the ground and studied it by flashlight, shielding the beam with their hands. The situation was clear. They couldn't go forward. They couldn't go back. The valley they'd just crossed would be crawling with Japanese patrols by morning. They couldn't go east. That would take them deeper into enemy territory. And they couldn't go west. The terrain dropped off into a gorge that was impassable for men carrying heavy loads and herding mules. They were trapped. Ferguson made the decision that would define the next 36 hours. They would stay on the ridgeline, dig in, and wait for an opportunity to break through or slip away. It was a defensive position, which violated everything Wingate's doctrine was built on. Chindits were supposed to move, strike, and vanish. They were not supposed to hold ground, but there was no other option. They started digging. The ridgeline was roughly 400 yards long and 100 yards wide at its narrowest point. It ran north-south with steep slopes on the east and west sides and slightly gentler approaches from the north and south. The vegetation was thick enough to provide concealment, but thin enough that movement could be detected if you were listening carefully. There was no water source on the hilltop. The nearest stream was back down in the valley they'd just crossed. Ferguson organized the position into 3 defensive sectors. The northern sector, covering the most likely approach from the Japanese strongpoint, was given to a platoon of British infantry from the King's Regiment. The southern sector, covering the approach from the valley, was given to a platoon of Gurkha riflemen from the 3rd 2nd Gurkhas. The western sector, covering the steep slope that dropped into the gorge, was left with minimal coverage, 2 sentries, and orders to withdraw immediately if they detected movement. The eastern sector, facing the valley, was covered by another section of Gurkhas. The mules were placed in the center of the position, behind a natural depression that offered some protection from small arms fire. The 3 Bren guns were positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire across the northern and southern approaches. The 2-inch mortar was set up near the command post, with orders to conserve ammunition unless the situation became desperate. By midnight, they were as ready as they were going to be. Ferguson briefed his men. The situation was simple. They were surrounded. They had limited ammunition. They had no artillery support. They had no air support. Calling in an airstrike this close to a Japanese strongpoint would reveal their position and invite immediate retaliation. Their best chance was to remain undetected, wait for the Japanese to move, and then slip away under cover of darkness the following night. If the Japanese attacked, they would defend the position as long as possible, then disperse into prearranged groups and make for the river independently. Every man was given a compass bearing. Every man was told where the rally points were. Every man understood that if they were overrun, there would be no organized withdrawal. It would be chaos. The night passed without incident. Morning came slowly. The jungle lightened from black to gray to dull green. Mist hung in the valley below, thick and unmoving. The temperature climbed. Men ate what rations they had left: hard biscuits, tinned cheese, a few pieces of chocolate. Water was rationed. One canteen per man until they could send a party down to the stream after dark. Sentries reported no movement. The Japanese strong point to the north was quiet. No patrols, no activity. It was possible the Japanese didn't know the Chindits were there. It was also possible they knew exactly where the Chindits were and were waiting for reinforcements before attacking. Ferguson sent scouts out at first light to probe the northern and southern approaches. The scouts moved carefully, staying low, using the bamboo for cover. They came back within an hour. Both approaches were being watched. Japanese sentries, small groups, not aggressive, just observing. That meant the Japanese had detected something, but hadn't yet decided how to respond. It also meant the Chindits' presence would be reported up the chain of command, and by midday, someone in the Japanese blocking force would make a decision about what to do with them. Ferguson ordered the column to remain in position and stay silent. No unnecessary movement, no cooking fires, no radio transmissions unless absolutely necessary. They would wait. The wait lasted until 1400 hours. That's when the first mortar round landed. It hit 20 yards south of the command post, in the open space where the mules were tethered. The explosion was sharp, violent, and loud enough to send birds screaming out of the canopy. Shrapnel tore through bamboo and flesh. One mule went down immediately, thrashing and screaming. Two others panicked and tried to bolt, dragging their handlers with them. Men dove into their foxholes. Ferguson shouted for everyone to stay down. The second mortar round landed 5 seconds later, closer to the southern perimeter. Then the third, then the fourth. The Japanese were bracketing the position, walking rounds across the hilltop to find the densest concentration of troops. The mortars stopped after 10 rounds. The silence that followed was worse than the explosions. You could hear the wounded mule still thrashing. You could hear men breathing hard, trying to control their fear. You could hear the faint rustle of movement in the jungle below. And then you could hear the voices, Japanese voices, shouting orders, coordinating, getting closer. The attack came from the south. They hit the Gurkha platoon first, advancing through the bamboo in a loose skirmish line, firing as they moved. The Gurkhas held their fire until the Japanese were within 50 yards, then opened up with rifles and a Bren gun positioned on the left side of the perimeter. The noise was deafening. The Japanese line faltered, took cover, and returned fire. It wasn't a suicidal charge. It was a probing attack, designed to test the strength of the position and force the defenders to reveal their dispositions. The Japanese fired for 3 minutes, then withdrew, dragging their wounded with them. Ferguson counted casualties. 2 Gurkhas wounded, 1 seriously. Ammunition expenditure, 47 rifle rounds, 2 Bren magazines, still acceptable. The Japanese came again 20 minutes later, this time from the north. A larger force, moving faster, supported by light machine gun fire from the tree line. The King's Regiment platoon opened fire at 70 yards. The Japanese pushed forward, got within 40 yards, then pulled back when the Bren gunner raked their flank. 2 more wounded, another 60 rounds expended. Ferguson realized what was happening. The Japanese weren't trying to overrun the position yet. They were wearing down the defenders, forcing them to expend ammunition, identifying the defensive strong points, and waiting for reinforcements to arrive. It was methodical, professional, and it was working. By 1600 hours, the column had repelled 4 separate attacks. Casualties were mounting. Ammunition was running low. The Bren gunners were down to 1 magazine each. The 2-inch mortar had fired all but 3 rounds. The rifle sections were reporting fewer than 30 rounds per man, and the Japanese hadn't committed their main force yet. Ferguson gathered his section commanders. The situation was unsustainable. If the Japanese launched a coordinated assault with their full strength, the position would be overrun within minutes. If they held out until dark, they might have a chance to slip away. But that meant surviving another 3 hours of probing attacks with almost no ammunition left. He made the decision to consolidate. The northern and southern perimeters would be pulled back slightly, shortening the defensive line and concentrating firepower. The mules would be released. They were a liability now, drawing fire and consuming space. The wounded would be moved to the center of the position, where they could be protected and treated as resources allowed. Every man was told to fix bayonets. That's when the Japanese stopped attacking. 16:30 hours. Silence. No mortar fire. No small arms fire. No movement in the jungle. Just the low hum of insects and the distant sound of something mechanical engines, maybe, or generators coming from the direction of the Japanese strongpoint. Ferguson sent a scout to the northern perimeter to observe. The scout came back 30 minutes later. The Japanese were repositioning. They'd pulled back from the immediate approaches and were setting up a perimeter of their own, roughly 200 yards away, in a crescent formation that covered the northern, eastern, and southern approaches to the hilltop. They were digging in, setting up machine gun positions, bringing up supplies. They weren't preparing for another attack. They were preparing for a siege. Ferguson understood immediately. The Japanese had realized the Chindits weren't going anywhere. They didn't need to assault the position and take casualties. They could simply surround it, cut off access to water, and wait for the defenders to collapse from thirst, hunger, and exhaustion. It was the smart move. And it was the move that would kill everyone on the hilltop within 48 hours. The sun set at 1845 hours. Darkness came quickly in the jungle, dropping over the hilltop like a curtain. Ferguson gathered his officers one final time. The situation was clear. They couldn't stay. They couldn't fight their way out. And they couldn't surrender. Wingate's orders had been explicit. No surrender, no prisoners. If a column was compromised, it would disperse and make for the river independently. Better to lose men in small groups than hand the Japanese a propaganda victory by capturing an entire unit. Ferguson issued the dispersal order. The column would break into groups of 5 to 10 men. Each group would be given a compass bearing, a map reference for a rally point near the Chindwin, and orders to move independently, avoiding contact, and making for the river by the fastest possible route. Officers would lead groups. NCOs would lead groups. In some cases, privates would lead groups. Rank didn't matter anymore. Survival did. The wounded who could walk would go with the dispersal groups. The wounded who couldn't walk would be left with morphine, water, and a revolver. No one said what that meant, but everyone understood. They would move at 0200 hours. Dispersal groups would leave at 5-minute intervals, using different routes to minimize the chance of detection. The Bren guns would be left behind too heavy, too noisy. The 2-inch mortar would be destroyed. Anything that could give away their movements would be abandoned. Men cleaned their rifles, checked their ammunition, wrapped their boots in cloth to muffle sound, said goodbye to mates they'd been fighting beside for 3 months. Some men shook hands. Some men said nothing. Some men just nodded and turned away. At 0145 hours, Ferguson received a message on the radio. It was garbled, broken by interference, but the gist was clear. Another Chindit column, Column 7, had broken through the Japanese blocking line 15 miles to the east and was making for the river. They'd taken heavy casualties, but they were moving. The implication was obvious. If Column 7 could break through, maybe Column 5 could too. Ferguson called off the dispersal. He gathered his officers and section commanders and laid out a new plan. They wouldn't disperse. They would attack. Not the main Japanese position that would be suicide, but the southeastern edge of the Japanese perimeter, where the ground dropped into the valley and the Japanese line was thinnest. They would hit it hard, punch through, and make for the river as a single unit. It was a desperate plan. It violated every principle of tactical movement. But it gave them a chance to stay together, to fight together, and to reach the river together. The men were told. Some of them looked relieved. Some of them looked terrified. Most of them just looked exhausted. They moved out at 200 hours. The column formed into a narrow assault formation, a lead section of Gurkhas with bayonets fixed, a center section with the wounded being carried on improvised stretchers, a rear section of British infantry to cover the withdrawal. Ferguson moved with the center, keeping the column together by sheer force of will. They descended the southern slope in near total darkness, moving by feel, using the trees and bamboo to guide them. The wounded bit down on cloth to keep from crying out. The stretcher-bearers slipped, caught themselves, kept moving. The lead section reached the valley floor and paused, listening. Silence. They crossed the stream. The water was cold, knee-deep, moving fast enough to make footing unstable. Men slipped, went under, came back up, gasping. They reached the far side and began climbing the eastern slope. That's when the Japanese opened fire. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness like lightning. Bullets cracked through the bamboo, snapping branches, thudding into trees, ricocheting off rocks. The lead section went to ground. The center section froze. The rear section returned fire, shooting at the flashes, trying to suppress the Japanese position. Ferguson shouted for the lead section to move. They got up and charged, screaming, bayonets forward, rushing the Japanese position with everything they had left. The Japanese machine gun opened up, cutting 2 Gurkhas down immediately. The rest kept moving. They reached the Japanese trench line and went in with bayonets, kukris, rifle butts, and fists. The fight lasted 90 seconds. It was brutal, close, and savage. Men grappled in the dark, stabbing, choking, biting. The Japanese fought back with the same ferocity, but they were outnumbered at the point of contact. The Gurkhas killed 6 Japanese soldiers, forced the others to retreat, and held the position long enough for the rest of the column to move through. Ferguson didn't stop to consolidate. He ordered the column to keep moving, to get as much distance as possible before the Japanese could organize a counterattack. They climbed the eastern slope, reached a ridgeline, and kept going, moving northeast now, away from the valley, into terrain that was rougher but less likely to be patrolled. They moved for 3 hours without stopping. Men collapsed, were dragged to their feet, collapsed again. The wounded screamed when the stretchers tilted. Ferguson kept them moving. At 0500 hours, they reached a clearing. Ferguson called a halt. The column dropped where they stood. Men lay on the ground, too exhausted to move, chests heaving, uniforms soaked with sweat and blood and stream water. Ferguson did a head count, 53 men. They'd lost 23 in the breakout. They rested for 30 minutes. Then Ferguson got them moving again. Over the next 4 days, they covered 60 miles. They avoided Japanese patrols, forded rivers, climbed mountains, and kept moving northwest. They ran out of food. They ran out of medical supplies. They drank from streams that gave them dysentery. Some men couldn't keep up. Ferguson left them in concealed positions with instructions to follow when they could. On April 2, 1943, Major Bernard Ferguson and 31 men from Column 5 crossed the Chindwin River and reached British lines. They'd been behind enemy lines for 47 days. They'd walked over 1,000 miles. They'd lost more than half their strength. But they'd held that hilltop, 50 men against 300. They'd repelled 6 attacks. They'd broken through an encirclement, and they'd made it home. The story of that hilltop fight never made it into the official histories of Operation Longcloth. Wingate's official report mentioned Column 5's withdrawal as difficult but successful, without elaborating on the details. Ferguson wrote about it later in his memoir, but the account was brief, understated, and focused more on the dispersal decision than the fighting itself. The men who were there rarely talked about it. Some because they didn't survive the war, some because they didn't want to relive it, and some because no one outside the Chindit community would have understood what it meant. But the fight matters. Not because it changed the strategic situation in Burma, it didn't. Not because it inflicted significant casualties on the Japanese, it didn't. But because it revealed something fundamental about the nature of irregular warfare, the limits of elite training, and the psychological fragility of soldiers pushed beyond their breaking point. The Chindits were not ordinary infantry. They were the product of Wingate's vision of a new kind of soldier. Men who could operate independently, think creatively, endure hardship, and fight without the logistical safety net that conventional forces depended on. They were trained to move, strike, and vanish. They were not trained to hold ground, and yet, when faced with encirclement, exhaustion, and impossible odds, they held. Why? Not because of equipment. Their weapons were standard infantry issue. Their supplies were gone. Their ammunition was nearly exhausted. They had no technological advantage, no firepower superiority, no defensive infrastructure. They were dug into shallow foxholes with rotting boots and empty stomachs, facing an enemy that had every tactical advantage except one: cohesion. The men on that hilltop had been together for 3 months. They'd crossed the Chindwin together. They'd marched through the jungle together. They'd hit targets together. They'd watched friends die together. They'd shared their last rations together. And when the Japanese attacked, they didn't break, because breaking would have meant abandoning the men next to them. It wasn't heroism in the Hollywood sense. It wasn't a conscious decision to be brave. It was something more primal, a refusal to let down the people who had been through hell with you. The bonds formed in that kind of shared suffering don't obey logic. They override survival instincts. They turn ordinary men into something harder to break than the enemy expects. Ferguson understood this. That's why he called off the dispersal. Not because attacking the Japanese perimeter was tactically sound, it wasn't, but because he knew his men would fight better together than they would survive alone. He was gambling that cohesion would carry them through, and it did. But cohesion alone doesn't explain how 50 men held off 300. Numbers matter in combat. Firepower matters, and the Japanese had both. So what stopped them from overrunning the position in the first assault? The answer lies in the nature of jungle warfare and the psychological friction it creates. The jungle is not a neutral environment. It distorts perception. It amplifies fear. It turns every movement into a potential ambush. It makes accurate fire almost impossible beyond 50 yards. It breaks up unit cohesion. It isolates soldiers even when they're surrounded by their own men. And it rewards defenders in ways that open terrain does not. The Chindits had the high ground, limited as it was. They had concealment. They had interior lines, which meant they could shift forces faster than the Japanese could coordinate attacks through dense vegetation. And they had the psychological advantage of desperation. Men who believe they have no retreat fight differently than men who believe they can withdraw. The Japanese, for all their tactical skill, were attacking uphill through thick undergrowth against an enemy they couldn't clearly see. Every step forward was a risk. Every burst of fire revealed their position. Every casualty slowed their advance. And when the first assault failed, it sent a signal to the Japanese commanders. This position is defended. This enemy is willing to fight. Overrunning it will cost us. That calculation matters. The Japanese weren't incompetent. They were professionals. And professionals know when to press an attack and when to shift to containment. They chose containment because they believed time was on their side. They didn't know the Chindits were planning to break out. They thought they were laying siege to a column that would collapse from thirst and exhaustion within 48 hours. It was the right tactical decision. It just didn't account for what desperate men are capable of when they refuse to accept the inevitable. The breakout itself was a calculated gamble. Ferguson knew that hitting the Japanese perimeter in a night assault violated every principle of tactical movement. Night attacks are chaotic. Coordination breaks down. Friendly fire incidents spike. Soldiers lose their bearings. Units become separated. And the enemy, if they're prepared, can turn the confusion into a slaughter. But Ferguson also knew that the Japanese weren't expecting an attack. They were expecting a surrender or a collapse. That psychological gap gave the Chindits a chance. Not a good chance, but a chance. The Gurkhas who led the assault did so with bayonets, because bayonets are quieter than gunfire and more terrifying at close range. The Japanese machine gunner who opened fire did so reflexively, not as part of a coordinated defense. The Japanese soldiers in the trench fought back, but they fought back as individuals, not as a coordinated unit. That chaos gave the Chindits the seconds they needed to punch through and keep moving. 90 seconds of close combat. 6 Japanese dead, 2 Gurkhas dead, and a hole in the perimeter wide enough for 53 men to slip through. It shouldn't have worked. Tactically, statistically, rationally, it shouldn't have worked. But war is not a rational process. It's a psychological process. And psychology, in the end, is what carried those men off that hilltop and back to the river. The cost of Operation Longcloth was staggering. Of the 3,000 men who crossed the Chindwin in February, only 2,182 returned. 818 men were killed, captured, or missing. Of those who returned, more than 600 were medically unfit for further service. Malaria, dysentery, typhus, exhaustion, malnutrition, and psychological trauma rendered them combat ineffective for months. Some never recovered. Wingate declared the operation a success. He pointed to the railway lines cut, the supply dumps destroyed, the intelligence gathered, and the psychological boost it gave to Allied morale. Churchill agreed. The Chindits became a symbol of British resilience, proof that the Japanese could be fought in the jungle, and justification for expanding the long-range penetration concept into a full division for the 1944 campaign. But the military historians who studied Longcloth came to a different conclusion. The operation achieved no strategic objectives. The railways were repaired within weeks. The intelligence was marginal. The casualties were unacceptable. And the psychological damage to the survivors raised serious questions about whether the results justified the cost. Ferguson himself, in his post-war writings, was ambivalent. He believed the operation proved the concept of long-range penetration. He believed his men had fought with extraordinary courage. But he also believed that the cost was too high, the support was too limited, and the strategic vision was too disconnected from the operational realities of jungle warfare. He never wrote in detail about the hilltop fight. When asked, he would deflect, saying only that his men had done what was necessary and that he was proud of them. But in private letters, he admitted that the decision to hold the position had been born of desperation, that the breakout had been a gamble, and that he carried the names of the men who didn't make it back with him for the rest of his life. The Gurkhas who fought on that hilltop received no special recognition. The Chindits as a whole were awarded the Burma Star, but individual actions were rarely singled out. The British Army, still reeling from the losses in Burma, didn't have the appetite for detailed examinations of small unit actions in a campaign that had already generated too many uncomfortable questions. The Japanese perspective on the fight is almost non-existent. Japanese records from the Burma campaign were incomplete, destroyed, or lost in the chaos of the war's final years. What little survives suggests the Japanese blocking force reported contact with a small British column, noted casualties, and continued operations. There's no indication they realized the significance of the engagement or the identity of the unit they'd been fighting. In the decades after the war, the Chindit story became contested ground. Military historians debated whether Wingate was a visionary or a charlatan, whether long-range penetration was a revolutionary concept or a wasteful diversion of resources, whether the psychological impact of the operation justified the casualties, or whether it was simply another example of British military leadership sacrificing soldiers for symbolic victories. The men who fought on that hilltop didn't participate in those debates. They returned to civilian life, carried their trauma quietly, and rarely spoke about what they'd experienced. Some stayed in touch through veterans organizations. Some disappeared into the post-war world and never looked back. And some, like so many veterans of irregular warfare, found that the civilian world had no frame of reference for what they'd been through. Ferguson went on to have a distinguished military career. He commanded a battalion in the 1944 Chindit campaign, led units in the post-war British Army, and eventually became Governor-General of New Zealand. He wrote memoirs, gave lectures, and remained a vocal defender of Wingate's legacy. But he never wrote a detailed account of the hilltop fight. That story stayed locked in his memory, surfacing only in fragments, in moments when he was asked about the men he'd led. One of those fragments appeared in a letter he wrote in 1978, 35 years after the fight. A historian had contacted him, asking for details about Column 5's withdrawal. Ferguson replied with a short, typed response. Most of it was factual: dates, locations, casualty figures. But at the end, he added a handwritten note. The men on that hilltop held because they would not abandon each other. I do not believe I could have ordered them to disperse if I had wanted to. They had decided, without saying so, that they would leave together or not at all. I was simply the man tasked with finding a way to make that possible. That is the only truth that matters about that fight. The hilltop, where 50 Chindits held off 300 Japanese troops, has no monument, no marker, no plaque. It's somewhere in the Burmese jungle, in a region that's been fought over, logged, and reclaimed by vegetation multiple times in the 80 years since the battle. The exact coordinates were never recorded. Ferguson's map references were approximate at best, and the few men who survived the fight couldn't agree in post-war reunions on exactly where the ridgeline had been. It's been erased, not deliberately, not maliciously, just by time, by jungle, and by the simple fact that most battles in war are small, localized, and forgotten by everyone except the men who fought them. But the fight reveals something that transcends its obscurity. It reveals what happens when doctrine meets reality, when elite training meets exhaustion, when tactical superiority meets psychological cohesion, and when men who have been taught to move, strike, and vanish are forced to stand, hold, and fight. The Chindits were an experiment, an attempt to prove that British troops could operate behind enemy lines, survive in the jungle, and strike at the Japanese with creativity and independence. The experiment succeeded in some ways and failed in others. The casualties were too high, the strategic impact was too limited, the psychological cost was too great. But the experiment revealed a truth about small unit infantry combat that remains relevant today. Cohesion beats firepower when the environment is chaotic. Desperation beats caution when the alternative is death. And men who refuse to abandon each other can hold ground that logic says they should lose. 50 men, 300 enemy troops, one hilltop, no names in the history books, no monuments, no official recognition, just a fight that shouldn't have been won by men who refused to accept they'd already lost. That's the story. Not of heroes, not of martyrs, but of soldiers who held because they couldn't imagine letting go. If you want to hear more stories like this, forgotten battles, overlooked units, and the human truth behind the tactics, subscribe.